They said money could buy anything. So one man decided to test that belief against history itself. He didn't build a house. He built a challenge to Europe, to time, to reality. Hundreds of rooms. Decades of construction. A fortune so vast it refused to end. But here's the question no one asked back then. When a dream has no limits, does it become a masterpiece? Or a prison made of stone? This is the story of the most unrealistic mansion ever built in America. And the cost no one talks about. At the close of the 19th century, the United States stood at a peculiar crossroads in its history. It was no longer a fragile experiment, yet it had not fully decided what kind of empire it intended to become. Railroads stitched the continent together, steel framed the skylines of new cities, and fortunes were being created at a speed the old world could scarcely comprehend. In this volatile space between tradition and reinvention, a new class emerged, men whose wealth was not inherited across centuries, but forged within a single lifetime. And with that wealth came a dangerous question: how does one make power permanent in a country that has no castles, no royal bloodlines, and no ancient monuments to command reverence? For one billionaire, the answer did not lie in industry, influence, or philanthropy alone. It lay in stone, scale, and spectacle. His dream was not merely to build a home, but to construct a physical statement so vast and so undeniable that it would force America and history itself to acknowledge his arrival. This was not the quiet ambition of comfort or privacy. It was an audacious attempt to compress the grandeur of Europe's aristocratic past into a single American lifetime, and then surpass it. The idea did not begin as madness. In its earliest form, it was a vision shared by many wealthy Americans of the era, a large country estate, inspired by European architecture, suitable for entertaining guests and displaying cultural refinement. But as years passed and wealth continued to accumulate, the vision evolved. Each journey abroad added new layers to the dream. French chateaux, English manor houses, Spanish cathedrals, none were merely admired. They were measured, catalogued, and mentally reassembled. What if all of them could exist at once? Not scattered across continents and centuries, but unified in a single place, under a single name. The chosen site reflected this hunger for dominance over both nature and distance. Isolated yet commanding, elevated yet accessible, it offered sweeping views that reinforced the illusion of sovereignty. Building here meant defying geography itself. Roads had to be carved where none existed. Materials had to be shipped across oceans, hauled through rugged terrain, and assembled by an army of craftsmen whose labor quietly sustained the illusion of effortless grandeur. From the beginning, this was not construction, it was conquest. As the foundation was laid and the first walls rose, the project began to drift beyond conventional definitions. Blueprints were revised again and again, not to correct flaws, but to accommodate ever-expanding ambition. A mansion became a complex. A complex became an estate. An estate became something closer to a self-contained world. Rooms multiplied not out of necessity, but possibility. Each space demanded its own identity, its own artistic lineage, its own justification for existing at all. The financial cost quickly escaped any rational framework. Budgets were no longer tools of restraint, but obstacles to be overcome. When expenses climbed, they were absorbed without hesitation, because the project had ceased to be about money. It was about permanence. To stop would mean to admit limits, and limits were precisely what this mansion was designed to deny. The structure itself became a mirror of its creator's psyche, vast, intricate, and increasingly impossible to complete. Yet even as the estate grew more magnificent, a subtle shift occurred. Time, once an ally, began to turn against the dream. The years stretched on. Architectural styles evolved. Economic conditions changed. The world beyond the estate gates moved forward, while the mansion remained locked in a perpetual state of becoming. What was intended to stand outside of history was now being quietly overtaken by it. Workers came and went. Entire careers unfolded and ended within the shadow of unfinished walls. For nearby communities, the project was both a blessing and a mystery, a source of employment, yet also a symbol of excess so vast it felt unreal. Newspapers whispered about its scale. Visitors struggled to comprehend it. And still, it was never truly finished. By the early decades of the 20th century, the contradiction at the heart of the mansion had become impossible to ignore. It was conceived as the ultimate expression of control, yet it demanded endless maintenance, endless resources, and endless attention. The larger it grew, the more it consumed not just money, but time, energy, and freedom. What was meant to immortalize its creator was quietly binding him to a structure that would never release him. This is where the story truly begins, not with triumph, but with tension. Because the most unrealistic mansion in America was not unrealistic merely in size or cost, but in the belief that any human vision, no matter how wealthy, could remain untouched by consequence. And as the walls continued to rise, too did the question that would haunt the project for decades to come. When ambition has no ceiling, does it create greatness, or does it eventually collapse under its own weight? To understand how such an impossible mansion could exist, one must first understand the man who willed it into being. He was not born into aristocracy, nor raised among ancient halls and inherited titles. His authority came from something far more modern and far more volatile: media power, industrial scale, and the ability to shape public perception itself. In an America increasingly driven by mass communication, he understood something few of his contemporaries truly grasped: that influence could be engineered, expanded, and immortalized if given the right physical form. From an early age, he displayed a restless appetite for scale. Ordinary success did not satisfy him. Each achievement demanded a larger stage, a wider audience, a stronger impression. Wealth, to him, was not an end but a tool useful only insofar as it could be transformed into visibility and legacy. Where others invested in factories or banks, he invested in symbols. And no symbol was more powerful than architecture. The mansion was never meant to be a retreat. It was conceived as a center of gravity, a place that would draw politicians, artists, financiers, and cultural elites into its orbit. Every invitation extended, every guest entertained, was part of a broader narrative, one in which the host positioned himself, not merely as a wealthy individual, but as a cultural force equal to the old world nobility he so deeply admired. To bring this vision to life, he turned to an architect who could translate ambition into structure without questioning its limits. Their relationship would become one of the longest and most complex collaborations in American architectural history. It was not a partnership of equals. The architect provided discipline, knowledge, and historical literacy. The client provided unrelenting demands, endless revisions, and a willingness to fund ideas that defied conventional logic. Together, they created something neither could have produced alone. Design decisions were rarely final. A completed wing might be deemed insufficient years later and altered without hesitation. Entire rooms were dismantled and rebuilt to reflect a newly discovered influence or a shifting personal taste. The mansion became a living archive of obsession, each space tied to a specific moment in the owner's evolving identity. What mattered was not coherence, but accumulation. Inside, the interiors grew increasingly theatrical. Ceilings were raised higher, staircases widened, galleries extended. Artifacts from Europe were acquired at astonishing cost, sometimes removed stone by stone from their original contexts, and reassembled thousands of miles away. In doing so, the mansion blurred the line between preservation and appropriation. History was no longer something to be studied, it was something to be possessed. Yet beneath the splendor, cracks were forming. The scale that once symbolized mastery began to impose constraints. Entire sections of the estate remained unoccupied, not for lack of purpose, but because maintaining them demanded resources that grew exponentially with each addition. Servants were required in numbers rivaling small hotels. Systems had to be installed, upgraded, and replaced repeatedly as technology advanced. What was cutting edge one decade became obsolete the next. More subtly, the mansion began to shape the man himself. Travel became less frequent. Decision-making narrowed. His world contracted inward, even as the estate expanded outward. The very structure meant to project power began isolating its creator from the society he sought to dominate. Guests came and went, dazzled and overwhelmed, but few truly understood the weight of sustaining such an environment indefinitely. As economic tremors rippled through the nation, the contrast grew sharper. Outside the estate walls, fortunes were becoming fragile. Inside, expenditure continued almost unchanged. The mansion now stood not just as a personal monument, but as a reflection of an era approaching its limits. Excess, once celebrated as proof of progress, was slowly being reinterpreted as a warning. By the end of this phase of the story, the question was no longer whether the mansion could be completed. It was whether it ever should have been attempted at all. The dream had achieved form, grandeur, and notoriety, but at the cost of flexibility, freedom, and control. What began as an assertion of dominance was evolving into a test of endurance, both for the structure and the man bound to it. And as history would soon reveal, endurance has a way of exposing truths that ambition prefers to ignore. By the 1920s, the mansion had reached what many believed was its golden age. Though construction never truly ceased, the estate had become operational in the only way that mattered to its creator. It could now perform. What had once been a private vision slowly transformed into a stage upon which wealth, power, and culture were carefully choreographed. The mansion no longer existed solely as architecture. It existed as an experience. Guests arrived after long journeys, ascending toward the estate with a growing sense of anticipation. The approach itself was designed to disorient and impress. Distance blurred perspective. Scale became difficult to judge. By the time visitors stepped inside, they were no longer certain whether they were entering a private residence, a palace, or a fragment of Europe transplanted onto American soil. That uncertainty was intentional. Inside, every movement was guided. Corridors opened into vast halls. Staircases framed sightlines like theatrical cues. Light filtered through imported windows and reflected off stone surfaces, chosen not only for beauty, but for their ability to evoke antiquity. The mansion did not whisper luxury, it declared it. Yet it did so with a cultivated seriousness, as if insisting that extravagance was not indulgence, but inevitability. Social gatherings became legendary. Politicians, actors, writers, industrialists, and foreign dignitaries found themselves dining beneath ceilings inspired by Renaissance cathedrals, then retiring to bedrooms grander than most urban hotels. Conversation flowed freely, but it was never accidental. Seating arrangements, pacing, and spatial hierarchy all reinforced the host's central position. In these moments, the mansion fulfilled its intended function. It converted wealth into influence. And yet, beneath the polished surface, complexity intensified. The estate required an enormous workforce, operating almost invisibly. Staff rose before dawn and retired long after guests had withdrawn. Entire logistical systems existed solely to preserve the illusion of ease. Food supply, water management, heating, security each demanded constant oversight. The mansion was no longer simply owned. It was managed like a city-state. The paradox grew sharper as technology advanced. Innovations meant to simplify life, instead multiplied maintenance. Electrical systems needed updating. Plumbing demanded expansion. Mechanical failures became increasingly disruptive because of the scale involved. Every improvement introduced new dependencies. The structure, magnificent as it was, resisted stability. More significantly, the emotional center of the project began to shift. What had once felt like triumph now carried undertones of obligation. The mansion expected to be used, admired, justified. Periods of absence felt like neglect. Periods of presence required performance. The estate no longer waited patiently for its owner, it summoned him. Outside its walls, the world was changing. Economic optimism, that defined the early decade, began to fracture. Markets wavered. Public attitudes toward excess grew uneasy. What once symbolized American possibility now risked appearing detached from reality. The mansion stood unmoved, monumental and indifferent, but its meaning was no longer universally admired. For guests, the estate was unforgettable. For its creator, it was becoming inescapable. The peak had been reached not in completion, but in contradiction. The mansion had achieved maximum splendor at the exact moment when sustaining such splendor became increasingly unsustainable. Grandeur had turned into gravity. Every stone that testified to success also added weight, and as the decade drew to a close, forces beyond architecture, economic, social, and historical, began converging. The mansion had been built to defy time. But time, quietly and without spectacle, was preparing its response. The collapse did not arrive with spectacle. There was no single night, no dramatic announcement, no moment when the lights suddenly went out and the dream officially ended. Instead, the unraveling began quietly, almost politely, as history so often prefers to do when confronting excess. While the mansion still stood in full splendor, the world that had made it possible was already beginning to dissolve. When the economic shockwaves of the late 1920s rippled across the United States, they did not spare even the most powerful empires. Fortunes that once seemed limitless revealed their fragility. Revenue streams tightened. Credit, once abundant and invisible, became cautious and conditional. For the first time, the cost of maintaining the estate was no longer an abstract concept, it was a recurring, unavoidable reality. The mansion had been designed for expansion, not restraint. Its systems assumed constant abundance. Every room demanded care, whether occupied or not. Roofs aged. Stone weathered. Mechanical systems failed with increasing frequency. The scale that once inspired awe now multiplied vulnerability. Maintenance crews worked continuously, but even their labor could not fully arrest the slow erosion of perfection. Construction, which had once symbolized ambition, became increasingly sporadic. Projects were paused, resumed, revised, and quietly abandoned. Blueprints gathered dust. Planned wings never rose beyond foundation lines. The idea of completion, never clearly defined to begin with, drifted further out of reach. What remained was an estate suspended in perpetual incompletion, its grandeur tinged with a sense of hesitation. Social life within the mansion changed as well. Guest lists shortened. The rhythm of gatherings slowed. Where once the estate had pulsed with conversation, music, and movement, silence now lingered longer between events. The mansion still impressed, but it no longer surprised. Its excess, once interpreted as confidence, now carried an undertone of defiance and insistence on maintaining appearances despite changing realities. For its creator, the emotional toll deepened. The estate had become inseparable from his identity, and yet increasingly resistant to control. Decisions were no longer guided by vision alone, but by necessity. Choices once made freely were now negotiated against costs, logistics, and public perception. The mansion no longer expanded with his will, it negotiated with it. Public sentiment shifted as well. In an era marked by hardship, symbols of extreme wealth became complicated. The mansion, once celebrated as a triumph of American ingenuity, now existed in uneasy contrast to the struggles beyond its gates. It stood intact, but its meaning had changed. Grandeur without context no longer inspired admiration, it invited scrutiny. And still, the estate endured. Not because it triumphed over circumstance, but because it was too large, too complex, and too embedded in history to simply disappear. Its continued existence became an act of inertia, rather than intention. What had been built to transcend time now depended on it. By the time the full weight of change settled in, the transformation was complete. The mansion had ceased to be a dream in motion. It had become a relic of ambition frozen, magnificent, and quietly burdened by the cost of having dared to exist at such scale. This was not failure in the traditional sense. The walls still stood, the rooms still dazzled. But the illusion that limitless wealth could produce limitless control had been broken. The mansion remained, but the certainty that once powered it did not. And in that silence between unfinished plans and fading certainty, the true legacy of the most unrealistic mansion in America began to take shape. When the mansion finally slipped beyond the grasp of its creator, it did not do so in a single decisive moment. There was no formal ending to the dream, because the dream itself had never been clearly bounded. Instead, ownership dissolved gradually, through a series of pragmatic decisions that stood in quiet contrast to the grand certainty that had once driven every stone into place. Age played its role. Health narrowed possibilities, and the world that had once bent to the will of enormous private fortunes now demanded accountability, liquidity, and restraint. The mansion, conceived as an extension of one man's identity, had become something too large to remain personal. What had once symbolized mastery now required surrender. The transfer of the estate marked a profound transformation, not merely in legal status, but in meaning. Once private, it became public. Once curated to impress select guests, it now opened itself to interpretation. The silence of its halls shifted in tone. Where it once carried anticipation, it now carried reflection. Visitors who walked its corridors no longer arrived to participate in power, but to observe it from a distance. They encountered rooms frozen between intention and abandonment, spaces that revealed the asymmetry between ambition and time. Every unfinished detail, every altered plan, every halted expansion spoke more honestly than perfection ever could. The mansion told its story not through completion, but through interruption. Historians struggled at first to categorize it. It did not fit neatly into narratives of architectural success or financial failure. It was not a ruin, yet it was not fulfilled. Instead, it emerged as a rare artifact, a structure that documented excess while simultaneously surviving it. In that survival, it gained legitimacy not as a private fantasy, but as a cultural record. The mansion became evidence of an era when Americans believed scale itself could manufacture permanence. When wealth, newly concentrated and barely regulated, was trusted to replace history rather than participate in it. The estate revealed how a nation, without inherited monuments, attempted to build its own mythology in stone quickly, decisively, and without patience. And yet, to dismiss the project as mere hubris would be incomplete. The mansion achieved what few structures ever do: it reshaped perception. It forced conversations about architecture, power, labor, and responsibility. It demonstrated the creative potential unlocked by ambition unconstrained, even as it exposed the cost of ignoring consequence. Its legacy, then, is not singular. It is dual. On one level, it stands as a warning proof that no private vision, however well-funded, can indefinitely outrun economic reality or historical change. On another level, it endures as a testament to imagination taken seriously, to a belief that ideas deserve physical form, even when their outcome is uncertain. Perhaps the most telling truth is this: the mansion outlived the certainty that created it. What remains is not the triumph of wealth, but the residue of belief. Belief that architecture could speak louder than institutions. Belief that legacy could be constructed rather than inherited. Belief that permanence could be purchased. In the end, the most unrealistic aspect of the mansion was not its size, its cost, or its extravagance. It was the hope that control could be final. The mansion stands today, not because that hope was fulfilled, but because it failed, and in failing, revealed something enduring about human ambition. We build beyond reason not because it is wise, but because it is human. And in that truth, the mansion finally found its place in history. By the time the mansion ceased to belong to a single man, it had already begun to belong to something larger. Not legally, but symbolically. It had outgrown private intention and entered the realm of collective meaning. What once functioned as an assertion of individual power now stood as a reflection of the nation that made such power possible. To understand the mansion at this stage is to understand America itself in the early 20th century, a country moving faster than its own cultural foundations could support. Unlike Europe, the United States possessed wealth without ancestry, power without monarchy, and influence without architectural tradition deep enough to legitimize it. In that absence, scale became substitution. Size replaced lineage. Cost replaced history. The mansion embodied this substitution perfectly. It was not rooted in regional necessity or inherited continuity. It was assembled, curated, accelerated. Its architectural language borrowed freely from centuries that had taken far longer to evolve. In doing so, it revealed a uniquely American instinct, the belief that history could be compressed, replicated, and owned. But compression carries distortion. What Europe built through feudal systems, religious authority, and dynastic patience, America attempted to construct through capital and confidence. The result was not imitation, but exaggeration. The mansion did not merely echo old world forms, it amplified them beyond their original context. Grandeur became spectacle. Permanence became performance. This is where the mansion's true significance emerges. It was not simply a personal excess. It was a national experiment. It tested whether wealth alone could manufacture legitimacy, whether architecture could create tradition instead of inheriting it, whether permanence could be engineered in a society defined by motion. The answer was complicated. Architecturally, the mansion succeeded beyond expectation. It proved that American resources, labor, and technical capacity could rival any civilization before it. Craftsmen adapted ancient techniques with modern tools. Engineers solved problems of scale that had rarely been attempted in private construction. In this sense, the mansion stood as a triumph of capability. Culturally, however, the result was more fragile. The estate never fully integrated into American identity, the way European palaces had integrated into theirs. It remained exceptional rather than foundational, admired but not absorbed, revered but not normalized. It was always the mansion, never simply part of the landscape. This tension mirrored a broader national uncertainty. America in the 20th century oscillated between humility and dominance, isolation and expansion, invention and inheritance. The mansion captured that oscillation in stone. It wanted to belong to the world's past while declaring independence from it. It wanted to be timeless while unmistakably modern. As decades passed, this contradiction became more visible. New generations viewed the estate not as aspiration, but as artifact. Its meaning shifted from what we can build to what we once believed we should. The mansion stopped pointing forward and began pointing backward, not into antiquity, but into a moment of unrestrained confidence that no longer existed. And yet, it did not become irrelevant. Instead, it evolved into something rarer, a physical question. Visitors did not leave asking how such a mansion was built. They left asking why. Why such scale felt necessary. Why excess felt justified. Why permanence felt urgent. In provoking those questions, the mansion transcended its original purpose. It became a mirror reflecting ambition without restraint. A mirror reflecting a nation discovering that power, once achieved, demands interpretation. And perhaps most importantly, a mirror reflecting the limits of believing that material permanence can resolve existential uncertainty. In this way, the mansion achieved a legacy more durable than ownership. It became an object of thought, a structure that forces confrontation not with wealth, but with desire. And that confrontation is far from over. The mansion did not rise in isolation. It was part of a broader phenomenon that swept across the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a moment when unprecedented private wealth collided with an absence of inherited cultural symbols. Across the country, other magnates attempted similar feats. They built estates of staggering size, cost, and ambition, each one designed to assert permanence in a nation defined by speed. And yet, most of them did not survive. Their ruins, some literal, others erased, entirely tell a story that deepens the meaning of the mansion that remains. To understand why this particular estate endured, one must examine the landscape of ambition surrounding it, and the subtle distinctions that separated survival from disappearance. Many Gilded Age estates were conceived with a clarity of purpose that proved fatal. They were built to be lived in, to function as seasonal residences, to serve families whose wealth assumed continuity. When fortunes fractured, heirs dispersed, or economic structures shifted, these estates lost relevance almost overnight. Their scale, once justified by lifestyle, became unjustifiable burden. Others failed because they attempted replication rather than interpretation. They copied European forms too faithfully, importing style without context. Their architecture lacked adaptability. Their symbolism depended entirely on the prestige of the past, offering little space for reinterpretation, once that prestige no longer commanded unquestioned respect. The mansion at the center of this story was different, not because it was smaller or more practical, but because it was never truly finished. Its incompletion, initially a flaw, became its greatest protection. Without a final form, it remained flexible in meaning. It could absorb reinterpretation without betraying its essence. While other estates demanded preservation as they once were, this mansion allowed itself to evolve. Wings remained unfinished. Plans remained unrealized. These absences created narrative space. History could enter without destroying identity. There was also the matter of intention. Many estates sought domestic permanence. This one sought symbolic permanence. It was built less as a home and more as a statement. When its original function dissolved, the statement did not. The structure retained coherence even when stripped of private life. This distinction mattered profoundly once public stewardship became the only path forward. Estates designed around intimacy resisted public adaptation. Their rooms felt intrusive. Their layouts resisted flow. Their identities collapsed without private occupancy. In contrast, this mansion's theatrical scale invited spectatorship. It was already accustomed to being seen. Labor history further complicated survival. Thousands of hands had shaped this estate. Craftsmen, engineers, artisans, many of them undocumented in legacy, yet embedded in stone and structure. Their work transcended personal ownership. The mansion carried collective effort, which made collective preservation psychologically possible. Across the United States, other great houses vanished not because they were unloved, but because they were untranslatable. They could not be reimagined without losing coherence. Their meaning depended on a world that no longer existed. This mansion, however, belonged to contradiction. It thrived on tension between old world and new, permanence and excess, aspiration and doubt. Contradiction does not age easily, but it does remain interesting. And interest, more than admiration, sustains survival. By the mid-20th century, the difference was unmistakable. While other estates decayed quietly, or were dismantled piece by piece, this one continued to accumulate interpretation. Scholars debated it. Visitors questioned it. Critics challenged it. It remained active in discourse even when inactive in purpose. Survival, then, was not accidental. It was structural, cultural, and psychological. The mansion endured because it refused resolution. It never answered the question of whether it was a triumph or a mistake. And so history kept returning to it, seeking an answer it was never designed to give. In that sense, the mansion did not outlast its rivals by being superior. It outlasted them by being unresolved. And unresolved monuments do not disappear. They wait. Behind the mansion's walls of stone and spectacle lies a story far less visible, yet far more fundamental. It is the story of labor not as a footnote to grandeur, but as its silent foundation. Every arch, every carved surface, every mechanical system that allowed the estate to function was shaped by human hands whose names rarely survived the records that celebrated the dream. The mansion could not have existed without an army of workers, many of whom lived lives defined by impermanence. Craftsmen arrived from distant regions, some from overseas, drawn by wages that promised stability yet delivered exhaustion. Their days unfolded not in moments of awe, but in repetition, precision, and risk. Injuries were common. Recognition was rare. The dream moved forward regardless. Construction stretched across decades, and with it stretched the lives of those bound to it. Entire careers were spent building a structure that would never truly be finished. Workers aged alongside walls still rising. Young men arrived with skill and ambition, only to leave years later with bodies worn by scale that never paused to accommodate human limitation. The estate demanded specialization. Stonecutters adapted ancient techniques to unfamiliar climates. Engineers improvised solutions where no precedent existed. Labor was not only physical, it was intellectual, creative, and relentless. Yet authorship remained singular. The mansion bore one name, one identity, one narrative. Beyond construction, an invisible workforce sustained the illusion of ease. Servants, technicians, caretakers, hundreds at its peak operated in silence to ensure that grandeur appeared effortless. Their schedules bent entirely around the rhythms of the estate. Their presence was essential, yet their visibility was minimized. Luxury required invisibility to function. This imbalance reflected a broader pattern of the era. Industrial wealth was celebrated as ingenuity, while the labor that enabled it was framed as background. The mansion crystallized that imbalance in physical form. Above, spaces designed to inspire awe. Below, systems designed to endure strain. And yet, the relationship was not purely exploitative. For many workers, the estate offered opportunity unavailable elsewhere. Skills learned here carried forward. Techniques refined within its walls influenced future projects. The mansion functioned as a training ground as much as a monument. Its impact extended outward through human expertise, not just stone. Still, the cost was undeniable. The scale of the dream demanded lives be arranged around it. Families adjusted. Communities shifted. Labor followed ambition, not the other way around. The mansion absorbed human effort with the same appetite that it absorbed capital. As decades passed and the estate's purpose shifted, the narrative around labor shifted as well. What had once been invisible became central to interpretation. Visitors no longer saw only opulence. They saw the systems that sustained it. They asked not just who imagined the mansion, but who endured it. This reevaluation marked a turning point. The mansion's legacy expanded beyond its creator. It became a collective artifact, shaped by thousands of individuals, whose contributions could not be separated from the structure itself. Authorship fractured. meaning multiplied. In this light, the mansion ceased to be solely a story of ambition. It became a story of participation, of human capacity stretched across time, of creativity constrained by hierarchy, of effort preserved even when intention changed. Perhaps this is the mansion's most enduring truth, that no dream of such scale is ever singular. It is always communal, whether acknowledged or not. The walls remember hands even when history forgets names. And as interpretation deepened, the mansion began to speak differently. Not as a declaration of power, but as a question posed to every generation that walks its halls. What does it cost to build something meant to last forever?